My name is Evelyn Miller, and the night they banned me from seeing my grandson, it felt like someone quietly closed a door on my life. No screaming, no scene, just a sentence spoken like a lawyer's verdict. It's better if you stop coming around for a while. That was it. I remember staring at my son's face on the porch, his eyes looking past me, not at me, and his wife Amanda standing behind him, arms folded, like she'd already won something she'd been competing for all along. The air smelled like dry leaves and cold earth, and I swear I could hear my own heartbeat louder than their voices. That was the exact moment when something inside me stopped being meek and started waking up. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't remind Brian that Lucas used to run into my arms every Friday afternoon, his cheeks warm, his hand tangled in mine, as if I were a seatbelt for his tiny world. I didn't say any of the sentences burning behind my teeth, like how I'd babysat during flu season and grocery shopped when they were broke and bought diapers and formula when Brian was laid off. I just nodded because that's how 67-year-old mothers survive heartbreak. They swallow it quietly and save the pieces for later. On the drive home, the road felt longer than it ever had in my 28 years of living in that quiet Indiana town. Every street lamp looked dimmer, and the songs on the radio felt hollow. I turned it off and listened to the hum of the highway, letting my hands shake on the wheel, the kind of trembling that tries to hide from the eyes but lives in the bones. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked too dark, too empty, too big for one woman, and too small for all that grief. I sat in my kitchen and placed my keys on the table gently, like placing a baby down to sleep. That house had heard laughter, birthday candles blowing out a teenage Brian learning guitar, and the sound of my husband's boots every morning. But now, it only heard the refrigerator buzzing and my breath breaking a little every minute. It's funny how a home doesn't feel like a home when the people you love are missing from it, even if the walls haven't moved an inch. I poured myself tea, but couldn't drink it. The steam reminded me too much of cold mornings holding Lucas in my lap, warming his hands around my mug, and teaching him to blow the steam like a dragon. I could see his small face when he said, "Gammy," the first nickname he ever gave me, simple, sweet, and so full of trust. It felt like a bow tied around my heart. And now, I might not hear that voice for days, weeks, maybe longer. All because a young mother thought I was trying to take her place. All because my son loved peace more than truth. All because I never learned to speak up when silence felt easier. I sat there replaying the porch scene over and over in my mind like an old VHS tape with static streaks across its edges. I asked myself what I'd said wrong. Was it the time I suggested Lucas needed a warmer coat? Or the time I noticed he coughed too much and asked whether they'd thought about taking him to a different pediatrician? Maybe it was when Lucas accidentally let slip that dinner was often fast food, and I made a comment about home cooking. Maybe I'd stepped on a bruise I didn't know existed. When you're older, people assume your words are harmless or meaningless, but sometimes younger women hear them as judgment or intrusion, especially if they're already insecure and don't want anyone to see it. I didn't want to blame Amanda. I tried very hard not to. But heartbreak brings its own vocabulary, and that night, it was spelling out betrayal letter by letter. I walked through the hallway, touching the frame of Brian's old graduation picture. That boy had once hugged me so tight, I thought my ribs might crack. Now he couldn't meet my eyes while telling me I wasn't welcome. Motherhood is strange that way. Children grow up and suddenly, you're optional. I went into the spare room, the room I'd turned into Lucas's little haven. His blue blanket lay folded on the rocking chair. The dinosaur pajamas I'd washed and dried last week still sat in the drawer. On the nightstand was the small wooden car he loved to push around, making engine sounds with his lips. I sat on the bed and held the pillow to my chest, breathing in the faint hint of bubble bath and crayons. I cried then silently, because after 60 tears don't come with theatrics. They just slip down like rain through a screen door. I let myself feel all of it, the rejection, the longing, the helplessness. But somewhere inside that sorrow, a new thought flickered. This isn't where my story ends. For the first time in a long while, I felt something like clarity, sharp and honest. If they were shutting me out, I needed to find a door that didn't require their permission. A door that might lead to something steadier than pride or misunderstanding. And that's when my eyes fell on the old leather-bound Bible on the bookshelf. Not because I'm the type to quote scripture every minute I'm not, but because I remembered a place where the walls never judged me. A sanctuary I'd abandoned after my husband died, because feeling faith felt too heavy. I put my coat back on, grabbed my keys, and got in the car again. The night was still thick and cold, but this time I wasn't driving home in defeat. I was heading toward the one place I knew my heart could speak without interruption, the church on Oak Street. Little did I know that quiet choice would start a chain of events none of us saw coming, not me, not Brian, and certainly not Amanda. The church on Oak Street sat on a small rise above the street, its white clapboard siding glowing faintly under the streetlights. I hadn't walked through its doors in years, not since my husband Michael passed. He'd been the one who loved Sunday mornings, shaking hands with everyone, humming hymns the rest of the week, like they were part of his bloodstream. When he died, I drifted away, telling myself that sitting in those pews alone would hurt more than not going at all. But that night, my feet moved without hesitation, as if the building itself had reached out a hand and pulled me forward. The parking lot was empty except for my old sedan and one battered Jeep that looked like it hadn't moved in a month. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. It smelled exactly the way I remembered, like old wood candle wax and memories I'd packed away in a box labeled later. The sanctuary lights were dimmed, leaving most of the room in soft shadow, but enough glow lingered that I could see the stained glass windows shimmering faintly. They looked different at night, like mosaics holding secret stories instead of sunlight. I sat halfway down the aisle, where Michael and I used to sit, close enough to the front that we could hear the pastor clearly, but far enough back that we didn't feel like we were on display. The silence settled around me like a blanket, not heavy, but steady and familiar. I took a deep breath, and for the first time that evening, my chest expanded fully instead of tightening with hurt. "I don't know what to do," I whispered aloud, the words sounding small in that large room. I've always believed that speaking your worries honestly is a kind of prayer, even when you don't know who's listening. I don't want to force myself into their lives. I don't want to fight, but I can't lose him. I can't lose Lucas. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. Tears in a church are like rain on a garden, they don't feel wasted. I remembered those early months when Lucas was born, how Amanda, exhausted and teary-eyed, had actually asked me to stay the night. How she thanked me through cracked lips when I rocked him so she could sleep. Somewhere along the line, gratitude had curdled into suspicion. I asked myself whether I had contributed to that bitterness. Had I offered help too eagerly, given advice too often? Maybe every little comment, well-meaning to me, felt like judgment to her. And Brian's sweet boy that he'd once been had always tried too hard to keep everyone happy. In the process, he'd lost the spine I'd worked so hard to raise. I folded my hands in my lap, not in a formal prayer posture, just comfortably the way I used to hold Lucas's hands when teaching him how to thread Cheerios onto string. "God," I murmured, "if there's a way through this that doesn't break us more, show it to me." Saying those words didn't magically mend the ache in my heart. I didn't rise glowing or enlightened, but a strange calm settled into my bones, the kind that comes when you let go of the fantasy that you can control people you love. You realize the only person you really steer is yourself. A soft, rustling sound startled me, and I turned to see a familiar figure emerge from the hallway behind the sanctuary. Pastor Reed, older now, grayer, a little stooped, smiled when his eyes adjusted enough to recognize me. "Evelyn," he said warmly, as though I came every week. "Haven't seen you in a while?" I laughed softly, embarrassed, but oddly comforted. "It's been a long time." He walked over and sat beside me, not pressing for explanations. That's the gift. Some people have the sense to leave silence untouched until you're ready to fill it. "You all right?" he finally asked. I hesitated, and then the words spilled out like water from a cracked pitcher. "I'm losing my grandson, maybe my son too." I told him everything about the porch, the ban, the silent car ride, the empty house. I didn't embellish or dramatize. I just laid the truth down like clothes folded on a table. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "Family hurts are always the deepest," he said, "especially when they come from the children you gave everything to." I swallowed hard. I don't know whether to push or back off or disappear. He turned toward me, meeting my eyes with a steadiness that felt like a hand on my shoulder. "Disappearing might make you feel noble, but it doesn't serve love. And pushing, that usually makes walls taller, not smaller. Sometimes the best way through is to stay steady, be present without being forceful. Make space without walking away." It was simple advice, but it hit like scripture. Before I left, I wrote a small note on one of the church's slips of paper and dropped it in the wooden prayer box. I kept it short. Guide me to what's right. Protect my grandson. Heal my family. When I stepped outside, the night air felt colder, but I felt warmer, somehow more anchored. I wasn't fighting, and I wasn't giving up. I was choosing something quieter, more deliberate. A kind of strength I'd forgotten I had. Driving home, the streets looked different, not brighter exactly, but clearer. Like grief had wiped the fog from my windshield. My house still felt lonely when I entered, but now it felt like a place of retreat rather than exile. I slipped off my coat, washed my face, and let myself breathe. The ache was still there, but something else sat beside it. Resolve. I didn't know how or when things would shift. I only knew one truth, deep and immovable as the church pews I'd sat on. I would not chase them. I would not fight them. I would simply remain open, ready, and unbroken. And somewhere out there, I hoped that a door would open again. I didn't expect anything to change overnight. Life has a way of moving forward, whether your heart is ready or not. Days passed, then a week, then 2. I tried to keep busy sweeping the porch, tending the small vegetable patch behind the house that Michael once loved, saying hello to neighbors walking their dogs. On the outside, my routine looked unchanged. But inside, every quiet morning felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. People in small towns notice things, especially when something feels off, like a chair suddenly missing at a dinner table. Mrs. Carson from across the street asked casually why she hadn't seen Lucas climbing my big oak tree lately. The question felt like a pinprick, but I smiled and said he'd been busy. I tried to keep my voice steady, though I could hear the thin crack in it like worn wood under pressure. One afternoon at the grocery store, I ran into Brian's high school friend Mark. He asked how proud I must be of my grandson starting preschool soon, news I hadn't even known. I nodded and congratulated him on his son's baseball season, but the whole time it felt like I was talking through a pane of glass, one separating me from a life I used to be part of. Still, I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't show up uninvited with a pie or a knitted sweater I knew Amanda would interpret as a message. I stayed steady like Pastor Reed told me. But the truth is, sometimes staying steady feels a lot like being forgotten. Then one day, While picking up mail at the post office, I overheard two women whispering near the bulletin board. They didn't notice me as I sorted through envelopes. "Heard she's drowning," one said. "Going back full-time was a mistake," the other murmured. "And the daycare fell through, and the little guy always sick." I froze, my fingers tightening around a coupon sheet. Sick. My heart jolted. I knew Lucas had asthma tendencies. We'd spent nights with humidifiers and warm apple cider when he was a toddler, but hearing strangers say "always sick" felt like someone knocking on a locked door inside me. On my way home, I drove past Brian and Amanda's apartment complex. I didn't park or linger, just slowed enough to glance from the road. The building looked tired, paint peeling near the gutters, chalk scribbles faded on the sidewalk. A single tricycle sat tipped over near the steps. Something about that overturned toy hit harder than a punch. At home, I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. I pulled out Lucas's old nebulizer from the hall closet, checked the tubes, plugged it in for a test run. I stocked my pantry with applesauce crackers, children's vitamins, things I used to keep for when he visited. It felt foolish preparing for a child I wasn't permitted to see, but preparing made me feel like I was doing something instead of just sitting with folded hands. That same week, I ran into a woman named Louise at the pharmacy, someone I'd known casually from the school district. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "I heard Amanda's mother moved to Florida. Surgery, bad timing for them." Another thread pulled taut. Days passed, and I noticed a shift not in my life, but around the edges of theirs. I'd see Brian's car leave earlier, come home later. Once I spotted Amanda at the corner store, shoulders hunched, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back messy as if she hadn't bothered with anything beyond survival. I felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly swallowed by the memory of her folded arms on my porch. Still, something inside me softened. One evening, close to dusk, I was watering marigolds when my neighbor's teenage daughter came jogging past, earbuds dangling. She slowed as she reached my driveway. "Hey, Mrs. Miller," she puffed. "Did you hear that family at the apartment? Someone called CPS about a kid wandering around alone?" My heart lurched so hard I dropped the watering can. "It couldn't be. Please, God, not that." She shrugged, unaware of my silent panic. "Probably nothing. They check, close the file, move on." I nodded stiffly, but after she left, I stood frozen in the yard hose, spilling water into the dirt. A child wandering alone, Lucas's age. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind circled like a restless bird. What if he'd been scared? What if he'd been coughing and no one heard him? What if he cried for me? But I didn't drive over, and I didn't make a call I might regret later. I sat in the dim kitchen, gripping the edge of the table until my fingertips tingled, whispering the same prayer over and over. Keep him safe. Keep him safe. Keep him safe. The next morning, I drove past the church before sunrise. I didn't stop, didn't go inside, just let the sight of the steeple remind me that I wasn't powerless just because I chose patience over confrontation. A week later, the town pastor stopped by unexpectedly. Apparently, he'd been checking in on people from the congregation. We ended up talking on the porch, the air rich with the scent of freshly cut grass. He listened quietly as I confessed how hard waiting was. "How do you stay steady when everything feels like it's slipping?" I asked. He smiled gently. "You prepare for the moment grace needs your hands." I didn't know exactly what he meant then, but I realized later that he was guiding me toward a truth. Sometimes the miracle comes not by fixing things yourself, but by being ready when life finally needs you. Because soon enough, that moment arrived. Not the miracle they wanted, where everything was perfect without me, but the one that pulled the thread loose until they had nowhere left to turn except toward the door they had closed. and I quietly, painfully, faithfully was still standing there. It was just past sunset, the evening everything came to a head, one of those gray, Midwestern dusks, where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or simply settle into darkness. I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen, wiping down the counter, and putting away leftovers that would stretch into tomorrow's lunch when I heard a soft knock on the door. The kind of knock that isn't confident enough to ring the bell. When I opened the door, I found Pastor Reed on the porch, his coat zipped up, hair ruffled by the wind. "Mind if I step in for a minute?" he asked kindly. I welcomed him inside, surprised, but also somehow not. God has a way of sending people at the exact moment you need them, whether you asked for it or not. He took a seat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd sat weeks earlier, trying to gather myself back into one piece. He wrapped his hands around the cup of tea I offered and sat quietly for a moment before speaking. "I stopped by their place," he said gently. My breath caught without meaning to. He didn't have to clarify which there. He explained that he'd been checking in with young families, and when he got to Brian and Amanda's apartment, something felt off. Amanda opened the door, looking exhausted, her voice thin. Lucas was coughing in the background, a persistent dry cough. I recognized instantly the kind that keeps a child up through the night and frays a parent's nerves to threads. I offered to pray with them, he said, but I could tell they were at the edge. Not spiritually, just life. Stress, fear, exhaustion. It humbles us all. I nodded, unable to say much. I'd known they were struggling, but hearing confirmation from someone who'd stood inside their home made it real in a way whispers never could. When he left that night, I stood at the door long after his car disappeared down the street. I wanted to run to my car, drive over, and scoop Lucas into my arms like I used to when he was small enough to curl on my chest. Instead, I pressed my palm to the doorframe and reminded myself, not yet, not my move. Over the next few days, small signs trickled into my world. A neighbor mentioned that Brian's car had been gone from the building until late at night. Someone at the pharmacy shared that Amanda had been buying the cheaper generic brands of medication. I never asked people, just talked. Small towns don't need prompts to carry stories from one set of ears to another. Quietly, I began preparing, not because anyone had asked, but because something deep in my bones said the time was coming. I stocked the freezer with homemade casserole soups and banana bread slices wrapped individually in foil, the way my own mother used to do. I washed Lucas's sheets, even though they hadn't been slept on in weeks, and laid out his favorite pajamas on the edge of the bed. The ones with the tiny green dinosaurs marching across the fabric. I even put together a small first aid kit with children's Tylenol, a thermometer saline spray, and spare nebulizer tubing. It felt strange, almost presumptuous, but preparing made me feel less helpless. One crisp afternoon, I was raking leaves when Mrs. Carson crossed the street holding her phone. "You might want to hear this," she murmured. She didn't say where she'd gotten the recording, someone inside the apartment building, no doubt, but I didn't question it. On the audio, I heard a child crying weakly, a muttered argument in tense voices, and then a door slam. The sound was faint, not dramatic, but it felt like ice water poured down my spine. I knew that cry. It was Lucas, and he wasn't okay. "Call them," Mrs. Carson urged, but I shook my head. If they're drowning, they won't grab the hand that pushed them away. They have to reach first. The words tasted bitter, but I believed them. Just as stubbornly as Amanda believed her pride would hold her family upright. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, tracing slow circles in the dark. I prayed silently, hands folded over my stomach, the way my grandmother taught me when I was a little girl. The room felt too quiet, and my heart beat loud enough to drown out my own reasoning. This is what waiting feels like, I thought. Not passive, but alert, like a parent listening for a baby to stir in the next room. 3 days later, the call came not from Brian or Amanda, but from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was a neighbor from their building. She spoke fast, breathless. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Miller, but something's wrong. I heard your grandson coughing so hard I thought, well, I didn't know who else to call." I grabbed my coat, didn't bother with shoes, and was halfway to the car before she even finished her sentence. Then halfway down the driveway, I stopped. I couldn't just show up, not yet, not until they opened the door themselves. I stood there, cold, biting at my bare feet, breath puffing white in the air. I waited, heart hammering, until minutes later, my cell phone rang again. This time it was Brian. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Mom, could you come? Please, we need help." My entire body flooded with adrenaline relief fear all tangled together. I didn't ask questions. Didn't say "I told you so." Didn't bring up that porch scene. Only 4 words came naturally: "I'm on my way." And as I pulled out of the driveway, a strange realization settled in me like warm light. This was the miracle. Not a punishment, not revenge, but a moment life had arranged with painful precision. Even the miracle they prayed for, ease, independence, pride, had unraveled into the miracle they truly needed. And I was finally being invited back in. By the time I reached their apartment complex, the sky had gone completely dark, and a thin frost was settling on the front lawns. I took the steps 2 at a time, faster than I had any business moving at 67, but a sick child will shave 20 years off a grandmother's knees. Brian was waiting at the door. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from crying I could tell, but from exhaustion and worry so deep it hollowed him out. He stepped aside without a word, and I hurried in. The living room was dimly lit except for a small lamp near the couch. Toys were scattered everywhere untouched, always a bad sign in a house with a 4-year-old. And then I heard a sharp barking cough from the hallway, the kind that starts in a tight chest and rattles its way upward. My whole body reacted before my brain could catch up. I dropped my purse on the sofa and went straight to Lucas's room. He lay curled on the bed, cheeks flushed, eyes damp from coughing. His breathing was shallow and fast, each inhale sounding like it was scraping through 2 narrow pipes. When he saw me, his little hand reached out instinctively. "Gammy," he whispered, barely audible. That single word both shattered and repaired my heart in the same instant. I sat beside him and brushed the hair from his forehead. "I'm right here, sweetheart," I murmured. "You're okay now." Amanda hovered awkwardly in the doorway. Her face was drawn, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, but her expression, oh, that expression was something I'd never seen on her before. Not defensiveness, not irritation, not pride. Just fear, real trembling fear. "We tried the inhaler," she said quickly, voice shaking, "but it's not helping enough." I nodded. "He needs a nebulizer treatment." Her eyes widened. "We don't." "I have one," I said before she finished. Amanda bit her lip, shame flickering across her face. Whatever battle she'd been fighting against me was clearly losing ground against reality. I went back to the car and returned with my bag, the nebulizer, the tubing, the small bottle of medication I always kept on hand just in case. Amanda watched every movement, silent, almost brittle. Brian lingered behind her like a man who'd just realized how fragile his world could be. As I plugged in the machine and fitted the mask over Lucas's tiny face, he reached for my wrist, gripping it tight, seeking reassurance the way a drowning child seeks air. The hum of the nebulizer filled the room, a steady, familiar sound I'd come to associate with healing and relief. I rocked him gently while the mist worked its way into his lungs, whispering small things, the same things I used to say when he was a baby. "It's okay to breathe slow. You're safe now. Grandma's here." When the treatment ended, His breathing eased just enough that his shoulders dropped, and he curled against me, drifting into uneasy sleep. I held him until the tension left his body. Only then did I look up. Amanda was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, head bowed, hands covering her face. Her shoulders shook just once before she stilled herself. Brian cleared his throat, voice hoarse. "Mom, thank you." He didn't need to explain what he meant. After I tucked Lucas in and double-checked his breathing, I walked back to the kitchen. The sink was full of dishes, the counter cluttered, a cold pot of mac and cheese still sitting out. The home of a tired family, not a careless one. Without asking, I washed the pot, wiped down the counter, and placed the nebulizer pieces to dry. Amanda stood nearby, leaning on the counter, staring at her hands like they were something she didn't recognize. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, flat with exhaustion, but cracked with vulnerability. "I thought I could do it all. Work, keep the house running, be the perfect mom. I didn't want to depend on anyone, especially not you." I listened, towel folded in my hands. I thought, if I let you in too much, Lucas wouldn't need me. Or Brian might lean on you instead of me. There it was. The truth beneath the anger. I nodded slowly, my heart softening in a way I never expected it still could. "I never wanted to replace you, Amanda. I just wanted to love him. And love you both in whatever way you'd let me." She blinked, surprised, and maybe unsure how to accept something that simple. Brian joined us, leaning against the refrigerator like a man finally ready to stand somewhere real. I should have spoken up sooner," he said quietly. "I let you both hurt each other because I was afraid of taking sides." He swallowed hard. That wasn't fair to anyone, especially Lucas. There it was, 3 people who had been orbiting around misunderstanding, finally landing in the same room. We stood together in silence for a while, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The kind of quiet that felt like space, opening, not closing. When it was time to leave, I kissed Lucas's forehead and whispered, "Sleep, little one. Tomorrow will be better." At the door, Amanda hesitated, then reached out not for a hug, but for a light touch on my arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "Truly." I nodded. "Call anytime, day or night." And for the first time since that painful evening on the porch, I walked away not with emptiness, but with something fragile and real hope. Yet I knew this wasn't the end. The next morning would bring conversations that might hurt growth, that might sting truths that needed saying. But something had shifted. A crack had opened. A bridge had formed. Love, quiet, stubborn, patient, had finally been let back into the room. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, as though my body already knew the day would bring something different. Something heavier and more important than simple chores or errands. The house was still hushed, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I brewed coffee, poured it into one of Michael's old ceramic mugs, and carried it to the kitchen window. Outside, morning light spread across the lawn in soft streaks, painting the grass in pale gold. The world seemed unchanged, but I felt different, steadier, as if something inside me had clicked back into place after being loose for far too long. I planned to wait, maybe even give them a day or two to breathe. But Brian called before 8 o'clock. His voice was calmer than the night before, but tentative, like a child asking permission for something he wasn't sure he deserved. "Mom, could you come by for breakfast?" 3 seconds of stunned silence passed before I answered. "Of course." When I pulled into their parking lot again, the morning sun made the gray siding look less tired. I carried a small grocery bag with eggs, bacon, and pancake mix. Old habits die hard. Amanda opened the door before I'd even knocked. Her eyes were less haunted, but still worn like someone who hadn't quite come back to herself yet. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. Brian was already scrambling eggs at the stove. Lucas sat at the table working on a coloring book, still a little pale, but breathing easily. When he saw me, his face lit up and he made a half-hearted attempt to run to me before deciding his legs were too tired. I crossed the room and kissed the top of his head. The warmth in that apartment felt vastly different from the night before, not triumphant or euphoric, just human, tender in its vulnerability. We ate together quietly at first, forks clinking, syrup being drizzled, Lucas humming nonsense under his breath. Then Brian set his fork down with a deliberate exhale. "Mom?" He started, eyes fixed on his plate. "We need to talk." I nodded, bracing myself, but also grateful we needed this. Amanda cleared her throat. "We owe you an apology," she said plainly. Her voice trembled on the word "owe," as though admitting indebtedness came with its own sting. "I pushed you away. I thought having you two involved meant I wasn't a real mother." Something softened in me, something that had been locked tight for months. "Amanda," I said gently, "every mother knows that fear. Even me. When Brian was born, I thought my own mother was judging me every minute she visited. Turns out, she was just waiting to be wanted." That made Amanda laugh, a small, startled sound that quickly turned to misty eyes. "I should have trusted you," she whispered. I shook my head. "You should have trusted yourself, and the rest would have followed." Brian looked from her to me, his expression torn with guilt. "I should have done better. I should have told Amanda that letting you help doesn't mean she's failing. I should have stood up, said something before it got this bad." I reached across the table and rested my hand on his. "Son, being a parent is hard enough. Being a husband and father at the same time, it's like juggling flaming torches on a moving train. You don't have to be perfect, just present." His breath shook as he released what felt like months of tension. Amanda wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We want you in Lucas's life. Not just when we're desperate, but always. But we need boundaries, clear ones." I nodded without hesitation. "Name them." "We really talked for the first time in a long while. They asked that I wait for invitations and not drop by unannounced unless something urgent came up. They asked that when I babysit, I follow their routines, mealtimes, bedtimes, screen limits, even if I didn't agree with every detail. They asked that I offer advice only when they asked for it, or at least begin with, 'Would you like a suggestion?' I agreed to every request, not begrudgingly, but with relief. We built the guardrails together, and for the first time, I could see Amanda relax, her shoulders lowering from around her ears. Then it was my turn. "I only have one boundary," I said softly. "Don't ever shut the door on me completely again. Even if you're angry or overwhelmed, keep the line open a crack. I can handle distance. I can't handle exile." Amanda nodded earnestly, wholeheartedly, then reached for my hand. Her touch was warm and not trembling anymore. Lucas finished coloring and climbed onto my lap, curling into me in the way that children do when they know they're safe. His breathing was steady, the faint whistle gone. I kissed the crown of his head and breathed him in the scent of crayons and syrup and childhood. That breakfast lasted nearly 3 hours. We laughed at old stories, made small plans, zoo trips, library days, even the possibility of a weekly Sunday supper. When I finally stood to leave, Amanda hugged me, not a stiff, reluctant hug, but a full, heartfelt embrace. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. I smiled against her shoulder. "Thank you for opening the door." As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not just hope, but belonging. My family wasn't fixed in one night, but we'd finally gotten to the table where fixing was possible. I knew there would still be rough days, that pride and fear might flare up again. But now, we had a path back to one another. And sometimes that's all a family needs. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it often does in Indiana. One mild day, followed by a surprise frost, then a warm breeze that carried the smell of cut grass and thawed soil. As the season shifted, so did the rhythm of our family. Lucas recovered fully in the weeks that followed. His cough faded, his energy returned, and soon he was racing across playgrounds again, shrieking with the kind of joy only a 4-year-old can produce. I became a regular part of their world, not as a replacement mother or a shadow, but as a grandmother who was wanted, welcomed, and useful. Every Wednesday, I picked him up from preschool. He would burst through the classroom door, flying toward me like he'd been shot from a cannon backpack bouncing. We'd walk hand in hand to my car, and he'd chatter nonstop about Fingerpaint's playground adventures and which new words he learned. On the drive home, he always asked if we could make pancakes for dinner, and I always said yes, even if the sun was still high in the sky. Amanda started dropping by too, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for a breath of fresh air, sometimes just to sit quietly while Lucas played. The walls between us weren't just lowering, they were slowly being replaced by windows. She told me about work stress, about juggling expectations, about the crushing weight of trying to be everything for everyone all at once. I listened without judgment, and every now and then she asked for advice, not every time, but often enough that I knew trust had taken root. Brian stopped skirting hard topics. He talked about how torn he had felt, caught between the woman he loved and the mother who raised him. I thought keeping the peace meant avoiding conflict, he admitted one Saturday afternoon while we fixed a broken garden fence. Turns out that just lets everyone bleed quietly. I told him something I wish I'd known earlier in life. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's learning how to stand together in the middle of it. We became a family again, not perfect, but honest. Our conversations stretched beyond surface-level politeness into something real. We disagreed sometimes. We apologized sometimes. And every step we took was deliberate. One Sunday, Brian invited me to join them for church. It felt fitting, full circle, though none of us said so aloud. We sat together in the same row I'd once occupied with Michael. During the closing hymn, Amanda slipped her hand into mine. No fanfare. Just warmth. Just acceptance. Weeks passed. Then months. And one warm evening in May, another kind of miracle unfolded. Brian and Amanda hosted a small backyard cookout. Lucas dashed across the yard with his bubble machine, leaving a trail of shimmering orbs behind him. Amanda tended the grill, while Brian set the table with paper plates decorated with cartoon hamburgers. The air smelled like charcoal cut grass and second chances. At one point, Amanda called out, "Lucas, come show your grandma what you made." Lucas ran toward me holding a slightly crumpled drawing. "It's us," he declared proudly. The picture showed stick figures, a small boy in green, a tall man with wild black hair, a woman with a triangle dress, and another woman, me, with silver curls and a big smile. We stood side by side beneath a child-drawn house with a crooked chimney and a big yellow sun. "Gammy," he wrote across the top in lopsided letters. My throat tightened. I blinked hard and managed to smile at him. "It's beautiful," I whispered. Amanda watched me closely from the grill, and when our eyes met, she nodded a quiet acknowledgement of everything that picture meant. Later that evening, when Lucas had gone inside to watch cartoons and fireflies blinked lazily across the yard, Amanda and I sat together on the porch steps. We didn't speak right away. Sometimes silence speaks perfectly well on its own. Then she said, "You came back when we needed you most, even after we pushed you away." She looked at her hands, twisting a napkin. I won't forget that. I took a slow breath, tasting the dusk air. "I didn't come back for gratitude," I said softly. "I came because love doesn't keep score. It shows up." She wiped her eyes with a laugh. "Sometimes I think God waited for me to get out of my own way." Sometimes I agreed God answers prayers sideways just enough to make us bend before we break. We sat together shoulder to shoulder, watching Lucas through the window, his little silhouette dancing to a cartoon theme song. I realized then that the miracle I'd prayed for wasn't about winning or being proven right or having authority restored. The miracle was endurance, patience, soft strength that refuses to vanish even when unwelcome. Eventually, Brian joined us on the steps and rested his hand on my shoulder. "Mom," he said quietly, "I should have trusted your intentions." I squeezed his fingers, and I should have trusted time. We all had lessons waiting for us. We didn't need more words. The kind of healing growing between us had settled deeper than promises. It felt quiet, sturdy, like roots pushing deeper into soil they once feared would reject them. When it was time to leave, Lucas barreled into my arms. "See you Wednesday, Gammy," he shouted, planting a sticky kiss on my cheek. I held him tight, memorizing the weight of him warm and real. As I walked to my car under the soft glow of the porch light, I paused for one last look at the house. It no longer felt like the place where I had been shut out. It felt like a home expanding one seat at a time, back to include me. At home, I sat down at my own quiet kitchen table, the same table where heartbreak once settled like a storm, and whispered a small prayer of thanks. No grand hallelujahs, no triumphant victory claim, just gratitude, because the miracle had happened, not the one they wanted, but the one we all needed. And now, if anyone listening has walked that same lonely road, feeling cast out, unseen, unneeded, I want to tell you this. Hold steady. Don't shout your love into closed rooms. Wait at the door, even if it hurts. People come back when the world reminds them who truly stands by them. And when they return, open your arms, not your scorebook. Because family is not earned or revoked. It is tended, forgiven, replanted, and grown anew. Thank you for spending this time with my story. And if it touched you or reminded you of someone you love, share it. Whisper it forward. And may your own miracles, however sideways they arrive, bless your home the way mine finally did.